America First is a doctrine of peace, not war. And this truth is especially relevant given the recent tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran, which has caused a lot of speculation and a lot of really frantic analysis concerning the potentiality of a broader conflict and America's role involved in it. Although while the geopolitical and the strategic questions continue to remain in flux, the moral question and the moral dimension of this entire thing is not at all being paid attention to. But in this video, we're going to fix that by evaluating the nature of America first, examining just why it is a doctrine of peace, and then exploring the philosophy of peace as a duty that all rational and virtuous men must perform if they are to exist in civil society. But before we get into that, my friends, hope all are doing well. I am Christian Moss. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with the philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our message is successful. Even if you disagree with me, my friends, we are starting a civic revivalist, civic conservative project that reasserts the fundamental philosophy of Americanism into the public sphere and defends it vigorously against its many foes. And if you wish to be a part of this revivalist, restorationist project, then please like, share, comment, subscribe. If you are so generous, you may also feel free to donate to me as well, but no obligation. Thank you so much, my friends, and now please enjoy the video. So, before we discuss the nature of America First and the philosophy of peace, it's very important to establish perspective. And perspective is actually what allows a lot of people to make errors in judgment when it comes to issues as complex as geopolitics. By perspective, I don't simply mean a position you have on a particular issue. By perspective, I mean how exactly you see the issue. And I think when it comes to any issue, perspective can either be the great enhancer of your understanding, it can bring you closer to truth, or it can impede your ability, not only to be charitable to those who disagree with you, which is essential for anyone that wishes to practice intellectual virtue, but also to understand the substance of arguments that you support and those that you don't. When it comes to war, and when it comes to most things that involve foreign policy in America, there are a few positions, a few perspectives of positions that are established. One perspective being that of the anti-war person. The other perspective being that of the pro-war person, the neocon, the interventionist. These terms and categories limit our ability to really understand what we're talking about and simply invoke in the minds of observers pre-established beliefs and ideas about the person that is under those categories, is being termed with those categories, and then encourages them to address that person and address their positions on that basis. This is not proper. It's not proper because perspective, the premises by which we evaluate something, will impact our conclusions as the laws of logic tell us. Perspective can give us pre-established conclusions that are not closer to the truth. So we must understand perspective and how it influences conclusions before we can substantively talk about anything. So for this video, I'm not going to be using those terms. I'm going to be speaking in a way that is much more adherent to nuance than it is adherent to heuristic. And I think that the sooner we abandon the sort of pro-war, anti-war categories as the end-all, be-all of understanding positions, the sooner we'll be able to entertain nuance and I think get better arguments necessarily. So, America First. What is America First? America First, and by the way, the significance of this is actually quite interesting because throughout this whole Israel-Iran U.S. conflict, America First has been established as a term that actually justifies, apparently, the United States bombing Iran. Now look, this is not a video about the geopolitics of this whole situation. It's a video about the morality of our approach to geopolitics. But I must say, there have been several folks, including people like J.D. Vance and others, that have said that it actually is America first to stop Iran from being a nuclear weapon, which then begs the question, well, how in the world is this exactly America first? What definition are you using for America first? And the definition that seems to be posed is that if America's national interests are threatened, we therefore have an obligation to go ahead and beat the threat.
Look, what the president said is so perfect about this. I think he gets to define America first because he's the person who ran, who was elected, and who actually leads this movement. And for all of the online chatter, what I see, and I've seen it very privately, of course, and I've seen it very publicly, the president is very focused on a core American national interest. And that national interest is the state of Iran should not have a nuclear weapon.
But What is America's national interest? Are these interests generated by a love and a care and a duty to the homeland? Or are these interests generated by entangling alliances which have the problem of competing interests, which may take away from the necessary care and duty that all countries have towards their homeland? This is never addressed. And so I just urge all of you, whenever you hear that term, ask yourself the question, does this action actually perform the duty that all nations are obliged to perform to their homeland? Or is it an entangling interest, or what I call a floating abstraction, that has no connection to the homeland substantively, but only speciously? I'm not going to get into the dynamics of Iran getting a weapon or whatever. That's not what this video is about. But this is something I want you all to keep in mind. But speaking of that, that's what America First is. America First is at first a proposition, and then it is at second an attitude. It is the proposition that the statesman, the nation, the government, ought to care about and put the concrete interest of the homeland above every other interest in the world. So this is a doctrine that essentially says that the concrete nation is what we are focused on. And that is also an extension of sovereignty, because sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty, recognizes the nation as a real existing thing that stands independent of other nations, and therefore must be considered to have its own desires and needs independent of other nations as well. The only way for a nation to enter into an alliance with any other nation is if the nation itself has sovereignty that enables it, that gives it agency, that enables it to actually enter into agreements with other nations. Without sovereignty, alliances do not work, because you cannot create a just compact if one group does not have the ability to make its own decisions, which sovereignty exactly implies. So it is at first an assertion of sovereignty, but at second, it is an attitude towards the nation, an attitude of patriotism towards the nation that places it, and not in a sort of jingoistic way, but in a sort of necessary way, places its needs over the needs of others that may be in those alliances. So it's at first an attitude, and it's also a obligation. Now, one of the things about America First is actually so important is that it recognizes what is called the principle of limitations. Whenever a nation claims sovereignty, it must necessarily also claim territory, because if a nation is sovereign, that means that it has control not just over its particular territories, but over the land upon which the territories are built. In order for a nation to be truly sovereign, it must recognize its limitations. Here's what war does. War actually overextends the limitations of a nation by scattering its energies and focus. And by doing that, actually surpasses the principal limitations to feed the project of war. And it therefore distracts focus from the homeland. So in order for a nation to truly be sovereign, in order for a nation to truly put its obligation to its own people, its moral duty to its own people, at the forefront of its consideration system, and necessarily do so, it must have a sense of limitations. And by having those limitations, it must have a sense of focus. But war actually scatters that focus, extends limitations, which is one of the reasons why entangling alliances are such a bad thing. And all three of those things actually undermine the concrete national self-interest and obligation that there is to the homeland. This sort of scatter of focus can only be justified if it is meant to defend the homeland. But if it is meant to go beyond that particular objective, then focus risks being lost and being cast towards other places that it need not be. This is one of the reasons why America First must be a doctrine of peace, because peace actually gives the nation the focus it needs to proceed wisely and prudently in its affairs at home and also in its affairs abroad. Foreign adventurism and war actually changes the parties that are involved in decision making, and by doing that erodes the obligation that the statesman has to his own nation by creating a conflict of multiple interests. When you hear people, for example, in the media say, we have a duty or an interest or an obligation to our allies, what they are inherently doing is displacing the focus on the homeland and placing it elsewhere. So when you have a problem of competing interests, it is much harder to actually fulfill the obligation, because man, by virtue of his nature, is a limited being, and nations, simply being a collection of men that have power, are also a limited being, and therefore they can only be extended so further away from from their actual proximity before it becomes disruptive to not only his focus, but his ability to carry out his obligations to those who he actually is bound to by virtue of his duty. This is precisely why, without peace, America First can actually work. So, oftentimes, when peace is talked about in terms of conflict, peace through strength is mentioned. In fact, many people have been justifying the bombings recently on Iran by saying this is an example of peace through strength. But peace through strength is actually a rather hollow doctrine that doesn't have any moral foundation to it, and only seems rather specious, in all honesty. Only seems speciously feasible when it's first confronted, but when it's actually dug into, it seems rather ridiculous. So let's actually break the phrase down. What does strength mean? Well, strength oftentimes means sort of muscular aggression, which necessarily shows conflict and does not create a foundation upon which cooperation can be built. It's muscular aggression that is supposed to create some kind of respect, some kind of fear within your opponent that's going to make them not want to do anything to you, and therefore create this faux sense of peace. But the nature of conflict is that it never terminates if it is built upon a shaky foundation. It merely evolves. This is why America has been fighting a war on terrorism for decades. Look, I'm 25. It's been fighting a war on terrorism since I was in Pampers, and it's still going on because the nature of the conflict was built upon a foundation of sand that shifts and changes and never terminates, because you can't really fight in abstraction. You can only fight a particular person, which is why it's important to have prudence when you go into any kind of conflict. So strength based upon a shaky foundation merely gives way to an ever-changing conflict that never truly terminates and keeps the focus of the nation divided and invested in an ultimately a dead end. That's precisely what's actually happening in the current U.S. Israel-Iran project, is that it's built on a shaky foundation that many people, even within our own government, admit that is not going to be able to actually be achieved anytime soon, i.e. the elimination of Iran's nuclear program, because of how sophisticated they are with hiding the material and how many decades they've actually been pursuing the bomb, and how many efforts have been used to take the bomb out and they haven't actually succeeded. So whenever you have these kind of very shaky foundations, you have something that's not necessarily going to be achieved. And then the shaky foundation, simply to justify its existence, because most people would understand the insanity of fighting a war you can never win, it justifies its existence by dangling the prospect of peace over the heads of the people involved, by saying, oh, if we do this, we'll necessarily get peace. No, peace through strength simply means let's create more conflict and let's use the prospect of peace to keep going on, when in all reality, peace does not require conflict. Peace requires cooperation, and you can't have cooperation when you're muscling your adversary, when you're muscling your interlocutor into an agreement with you. So peace through strength is actually a fundamentally flawed concept. You don't have peace through strength. You get peace through prudence, peace through wisdom. You get peace through cooperation. You get peace through diplomacy. You get peace through charitability. You get peace through goodwill. All of these concepts adhere to the principle of peace and don't erode it like conflict does. This is not a doctrine of pacifism. I'm not saying violence has no moral role at all in handling conflict. It absolutely does. But it must be in defense of concrete interest. It must be in pursuit of obligation to the homeland. And it must be framed in terms of justice, concrete justice, which simply defends the homeland, which defends our covenants and our promises, and most importantly, defends the rights of the people. Conflict that goes beyond that and goes to crusading and fighting for abstract notions is detached from any kind of moral justification and becomes justified solely by artificial compacts which do not serve the people and therefore are not America first. So now we must actually explore peace, the principle and idea of peace. And my argument is that peace is a duty that all virtuous and rational men have by necessity of them existing within civil society. And to understand this more, we must look at the tenets of human nature. So in the early Enlightenment period, there was a debate about what kind of creature man was and what kind of principles must be laid down, what kind of order rather, and structure must be laid down for him in society in order for him to be able to exist and exist well. And Thomas Hobbes had this idea that all men were just nasty and brutish creatures who, left to their own devices, would simply create war and conflict amongst each other, because that is who we were as human beings. That's what our nature was, a nature of aggression and brutality rather than a nation of goodwill, generosity, and warmth. And so he believed that you needed to have a totalitarian state in order to keep back the excesses of our nature, so-called. Well, others came along, and like others like Samuel Pufendorf and Grotius and others came along, and they posed a very different idea of man that actually holds up more to historical evidence that man is not necessarily inherently a creature of violence and aggression, because if he was, civilization, social relationships would all be impossible. He is a creature of many different mixed principles, some of which are aggressive, but others which are overall conducive to the creation and establishment and maintenance of society, and that is the principle of sociability, as Grotius called it, which is our tendency to want to have social relationships, to want to have friendships, to want to build alliances, and to want to build community. And that underlies our entire involvement in society at first. But in order for sociability to exist, you must have a sense of goodwill amongst the people, and you also must have a sense of non-aggression amongst the people as well. And this is where peace comes in. Peace is a duty to all men, because without peace, society becomes impossible. Without peace, human life becomes impossible. Without peace, the very premise of any kind of social cooperation is rendered nullified, because without peace, a different set of expectations are foisted upon the people. You no longer expect cooperation with your neighbor. You expect brutality from him, so you will then therefore perform an act of self-preservation, of instinctual self-preservation, to beat back his expected brutality. Peace shifts perspective. Peace shifts expectations, and therefore it shifts obligations. So located deep in our nature is this desire for peace. And it becomes a duty to us and a virtue, not in the Aristotelian sense where it helps us become better people, but in the more general moral sense where it actually helps us conform to right conduct. It becomes a virtue for all of us. Now, we have to understand also the nature of peace and just how exactly it preserves our sociability. There are several parts of peace. There are several constituent parts of peace. There's calmness, there's sober conduct, there's cooperation, and there is creative function. Let's go over each of these. Calmness. As I mentioned, peace, by excluding the immediacy of aggression, creates a sense of calmness amongst men, which then gives them the ability to focus on other things that have nothing to do with self-defense or nothing to do with immediate aggression, to build, to actually be creative, to actually, which is part of the creative function, to actually cooperate, to actually work, to do so many things that are essential to the preservation of human life. This sense of calmness that is brought by excluding aggression is essential for any social behavior. Then this comes sober conduct. When we're given the ability to think beyond immediacy of conduct, to think beyond brutality, we can then conform our conduct to a more sound and sober tenor and tone to it. There's no quote, again, by John Adams, that I study war so that my children can study peace, or can study art, poetry, and philosophy. That's a very rough approximation, a paraphrasing of that quote, but it's true. If we are able to understand exactly how human behavior can deviate from the social principle, then we can understand how to restrain that, and therefore we can focus on things that, within the absence of aggression, can't exactly be focused on. And then, of course, this necessarily leads to cooperation. The more our conduct becomes rational and sober, the more we cooperate with others, because man by himself is a limited being and can only do so much by himself. But him recognizing the importance of this cooperation, he goes into compacts with others. But when he's in aggression, he no longer is going into compacts with others, he's going in compacts against others, which of course deteriorates the social principle as well. And then this, of course, allows creativity to exist. So all these parts of peace are produced when it is actually impactful in society and is actually practiced in society. And just like human beings, when there is peace, they can cooperate, they can have sober conduct. Nations, some of being a collection of human beings, also can cooperate and have sober conduct when the presence of peace is there, and then they can also fulfill the duties they have to their own people. And since peace produces sober conduct, it can also guard against evil intentions by laying the groundwork for recognizing them and stopping them before they come into fruition by emphasizing focus. And focus produces the clarity of mind that allows us to prevent problems before they actually become problems. So peace is not simply an obligation of nations. Peace is not simply something wise to have in a geopolitical sense. Peace is also something that we must have necessarily to function as human beings, to function properly and orderly. And so it should be no secret that peace is essential whenever it comes to a geopolitical situation. This is rather a realist perspective on the issue of peace. I'm very well aware that on the world stage there are plenty of actors that do not want peace, in fact want to have things that are not so peaceful and wish to develop to goals that also would ultimately harm peace. And I also understand that, again, there is a need to have a strong posture when it comes to negotiations. However, I also understand that political capital, social capital, and the benefits produced by an interconnected economic global system also produce incentives to behave in a manner that is not necessarily totally aggressive, but is also sober, that is also clear-minded, and also has focus. And I also understand that if you set a standard that aggression is going to be how you get peace, you will never have peace. You will merely have the illusion of peace that goes away the moment the other party you are aggressing is no longer afraid of you, no longer intimidated by you, and decides to get some mojo of their own. So this is not necessarily mere idealism. This is a recognition of what you must have to have sustained, lasting global relationships that do not deteriorate into conflict. And it ought to be the station of the United States to follow the presidents like Grover Cleveland and Madison, who were very clear that we do not go abroad looking for monsters to slay, but we instead seek to have peace here at home, and we confine ourselves to understanding that while seeking to cooperate with others on the global stage that enrich our homeland. This is not isolationism. This is a kind of moral realism that deals with the concrete obligations that our statesmen have to our country, and not towards the conflicting interests that exist abroad. In this moment, my friends, Americans must embrace the virtue of peace in this age of war. And by doing so, we must understand that not doing so will necessarily lead to a deterioration of moral duties in this country, and will also necessarily lead to a more perilous and precarious global situation that does not benefit neither America nor the world. So from any practical perspective, this must be what we do. But also, if we wish to beat the foes that have managed to erode our sense of civic understanding in this country, who have managed to recast the character of our nation as that of a villain, who have managed to not only do that, but also occupy the institutions in our country and move them towards destructive ends, then we must first understand that our focus must be on reorienting conscience within our nation, rather than trying to reorient the relations of other nations. Once you recognize these things, my friends, I think that we're going to have a much sober understanding of what's going on, a much better understanding of going on, and not only that, but I also believe that real lasting non-aggression can be achieved. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to ensure our video gets out there. My friends, study history, study philosophy, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive. Bye, guys.